Welcome to the Night Tube. I'm Stephen Knight, and I'm very pleased to welcome Helen Pluckrose to the show. Helen, how the hell are you?
I'm pretty good, and it's lovely to be here and see you again, Stephen.
I know, it's been a while. When were we last in the same room together?
I think that was a hotel in London.
Oh, okay. This is that was the very posh hotel in London. That was the Speaking Truth to Social Justice conference, wasn't it?
Yes, that was that day-long thing that just exhausted absolutely everybody, I think.
Yeah.
It was a bit intense, wasn't it? I think there were 8 lectures or something in the end, and then fortunately there was Andrew Doyle at the end to give everybody a bit of a wind down and relief.
Yeah, for sure. Andrew's great at that. Have you ever seen him do his stand-up routines at all?
I have.
He's excellent. He keeps threatening to kind of quit stand-up, I think, and concentrate on his writing, which would be great. Obviously, because he's a fantastic writer, but I sort of love the stand-up as well. I just want him to do everything, I think, for my own selfish purposes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I do want to touch on that event a little bit later on, actually. Before we get into that, maybe you could just give us a brief description, for those who don't know, of what it is you'd say you do. How would you even describe what you do at this point?
At this point, my main purpose is trying to protect individuals from being cancelled, fired, or forced to affirm particular ideological beliefs they don't, in fact, actually believe to be true. So I'm doing this in a number of ways. Firstly, by trying to break down what is often known as critical social justice scholarship, or in activist terms, wokeism. I'm trying to break down those ideas and get people to understand how they work so that they feel more confident to articulate objections to them. Because so many people say to us, it just feels wrong. I don't know why. How can something called social justice be wrong? But it just feels wrong. And so I'm looking at the authoritarianism, the anti-science, the irrationalism, the censoriousness of it and where it all comes from. And generally now we have Counterweight, which its primary purpose is to have a caseworker system where somebody comes in and they are in danger of some kind of disciplinary action. And then we can guide them to the right resources, or we can help them set up conversations and that they need to have at work. And generally, our aim is to get them to fix a problem arising in their organisation internally and quietly. So if we succeed, nobody ever knows we had anything to do with it. It's only if we fail that we then have to pass them on to lawyers or the Free Speech Union, or, they go public with the press or something.
All right, that's really interesting, because I kind of, that's a really good idea, because I think a lot of this is people not having the tools specifically, or know the correct terminology to speak out or push back against a lot of this. And like you say, it does instinctively feel wrong, because a lot of this is now telling us to focus exclusively on immutable characteristics, whether it be gender, whether it be skin colour, things like that. And I suppose we've come through a sort of a few decades now, really, well, certainly in the UK, of concerted anti-racism, and a lot of progress being made in that direction, and the idea of colourblindness being championed. But the proponents of the intersectional ideology will say that doesn't get the complete picture in view, and we actually do people an injustice by not acknowledging their, I would say, they'd say lived experience and their skin colour, gender, etc. How would you sort of counteract that argument that actually, if we take those things into account, it is beneficial for the people involved?
I think the critics of the colourblind approach tend to conflate colourblindness with racism blindness. So the idea, what is meant by people who want a colourblind society, is that we want a society in which somebody's skin colour doesn't cause us to have any moral or social reaction to them. There's no information attached to that, apart from perhaps what kind of sunblock they'll need or what colours will suit them, So we're race blind. Colour blindness is just about not adding social significance to race, because it doesn't exist naturally. We add it in there. Racism blindness, which sometimes people can fall into, is assuming that we've already solved all the problems, that there isn't really any racism left. We're all post-racial now. And so I sometimes see, and it's a shame, people pushing back at those who see racism everywhere by refusing to see racism anywhere.
Yeah.
Whereas
that is a big problem. But I mean,
yeah.
I suppose I see it often as well, because it kind of plays into the boy who cried wolf narrative a little bit, doesn't it? If somebody is constantly shouting about racism where it doesn't exist, it does engender a certain higher level of skepticism towards genuine claims of racism going forward, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, this is the thing now. If I see somebody online has been called a racist, I'm more inclined to think that they've said something considered problematic according to social justice ideas, rather than that they've discriminated against anybody because of their race. So that's I think a real disservice done by this cheapening of language like racism, like white supremacy. You know, white supremacists exist. And by making everybody who is white a white supremacist by dint of just being socialized into a white supremacist system that's theorized to exist, really makes it harder for us to distinguish between people who genuinely are being racist and people who genuinely don't go about their lives looking at what colour people are and attaching social significance to that.
About 9 times out of 10 now, if somebody's labelled a Nazi online, they're probably not a Nazi, I think. And that's a very sad blunting of fairly serious and important terms. I mean, it might be worth just talking a little bit about privilege and how it pertains to the UK, because obviously people will be told now, young white people, that they're privileged by default of their skin colour. They'll be told essentially they are defined entirely by their skin colour, and this leads into what things they're allowed to opine on. And for me, sometimes feels like class is probably a bigger issue in the UK. For instance, I know living in sort of North Manchester, the working class environment, if I went knocking on the doors around here and tried to explain, you know, white privilege to them, they'd think I was an absolute lunatic. And I kind of think they'd be right. But I mean, how much stock do you put in this idea of white privilege, this idea that just by virtue of my skin colour, doors have been opened for me that wouldn't have been open for people who are non-white, for instance?
I mean, I think there are right and wrong answers. There's objective truths here. So the problem is that we're having trouble at getting at what those objective truths are, because social science at the moment is so strongly dominated by theoretical scholarship rather than empirical scholarship. So that's another thing that we're trying to do, is dig out a lot of the actual rigorous empirical scholarship that is being done into racism and other forms of bigotry, because there does seem to be a disparity where Black women are more likely to die in labour. Now, why is that? That's a question that really needs answering. It's no good saying white supremacy or whiteness or privilege. We need to actually look at why this is happening in a rigorous way. I've tried speaking to some sociologists about this specifically, and they've told me the numbers are so small in the UK of Black women who have died that it's not statistically significant. But I think in the US, there's been a larger scale study which has shown that infant mortality and the mortality of the mother does correlate by race. Now, there must be a reason for that, and we need rigorous scholars looking into what that reason is.
I agree. I suppose the problem becomes when you start with the assumption of racism and then work backwards from it. I think we had something that's not exactly the same, but you can draw parallels, is the COVID death stats in the UK. And a lot of work was done to suggest that there was a lot of racism at play, leading to a significant disproportionate statistical death in terms of BAME or ethnic minorities in this country. And I suppose can you objectively demonstrate something like racism? If that were true, I mean, let's think about it in terms of our NHS is systemically racist and the staff there are not doing as much as they should purposely when it comes to ethnic minorities. How could you even go about demonstrating something like that empirically anyway?
I don't know. I think I read something by Saloni Datani, and she was looking into causes of greater sort of mortality and infection rate among ethnic and racial minorities. And I think, I don't want to misquote her, but I think she argued that most of it could come down to them tending to live in cities, being in frontline jobs and having larger families with more people going in and out and having contact. So that could explain a large part of it. But the thing is, the conversation would be closed down if we just have a theoretical approach to it. Do we need to actually be looking into vitamin D, for example, or do we need to be looking into the balance of the NHS? I think if everybody who wasn't white suddenly disappeared from London, the NHS would have no staff. It's not. We just need really good scholarship into this. I believe that white privilege is a thing that exists in many spheres of society. I think that it exists in more spheres than, say, black privilege. I think the idea of black privilege is tiny, and we only ever see people pretending to be black in very sort of tiny academic and activist spaces. So that's where perhaps there is an advantage in being black. In a lot of other places, I don't know, if you're a builder and you're applying for jobs, are you likely to be turned down in favour of a white man? I don't know. There are racist attitudes that still exist, so that's quite possible that does happen.
So how would you go about the issue of diversity quotas, or this push for certain jobs within high-paid roles? Now, I think the BBC have done this a few times where they put out adverts for people and they specifically tailor that job description towards ethnic minorities or people from the BAME community, as they'll call it. And that is, although I think potentially damaging, it is in many cases a well-intentioned effort to readdress what they class as racial inequality. And if that is the case, that we have a racial imbalance, then what is the main issue with trying to redress it in that sense?
So I think when it comes to what we would call positive discrimination and the Americans call affirmative action, I think there is a place for this. I think that we need a more sophisticated and complex analysis of this than is allowed by things like critical race theory and post-colonial theory, when we're looking at what barriers people face in accessing high prestige jobs. For example, I don't think that what Marxists have often complained when we have things like racial quotas is that what happens then is that rich black people who have had a private education and were always likely to do well anyway get the jobs, and then there is no upward mobility for poorer communities. And so they argue quite specifically for a focus on class. And I think there's a lot of sense in that, although it is quite, I think that's a bit too simplistic as well. I think race factors in as well. I think we need to be able to have a wider look. So I think I discussed this with my adoptive daughter, whose name we mustn't mention, but who you've met. And she believes that that white privilege certainly exists. And this is because she, as a non-white Londoner, was harassed by police with her friends quite a lot for going about their own business in a way that I wasn't. And I think that she's probably quite right about that. However, I also know that I was... when I was 18, before we had our own place, I would drive around late at night with my school friends. We'd all get together and we'd have a little smoke or whatever. And every single night, the police would pull us over. The thing that made the police go away was my accent, generally, and my address. So we're looking at privileges in a different way. First of all, I had female privilege. The police are much less likely to hassle me. Then I would be the one to speak, and I would say, is there some kind of problem, officer? Do I look like a drug addict? And they would back off, because they would know that my background is middle class. My parents could possibly be lawyers. They could cause great problems for them. So there's an element there as well where class does intersect with race, and we focus a lot on race and not a lot on class. I wouldn't say my husband, for example, who went to a absolutely terrible school, which he left without being able to read because it was that terrible, and they closed it down the year after he left. He had to learn as an adult, and he had to leave at 14 and get a job to help support his family. How is he, as a white man, privileged over definitely me as a white woman, but over a lot of other black or ethnic minority people who have had financial advantages?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, class is something I never really thought of it in terms of my individual identity. I can hand on heart say I don't think I've been personally discriminated against because of my, socioeconomic status, but I appreciate it plays into a lot of my, my education, potential opportunities, things like that. And it's only something I've been caused to question a lot more upon having been being constantly told I'm privileged for being white. And then when you kind of stack up the facts and the upbringing versus the idea of privilege, it just doesn't work. And I can see this leading to a lot of resentful young white men, which, and there's no delicate way of skirting around this, and a lot of people have suggested it far more eloquently than I have, but you can't help but wonder whether or not we're going to see some sort of response to it. And obviously that response isn't always as well measured, and it doesn't always come from a liberal perspective like yours does. And I suppose the big worry is a resurgence of a form of white nationalism, something that would make white nationalism more attractive to people, again, who are young, naive, just coming into this argument and possibly don't know better. Is that something that's on your radar as a concern?
I do worry about this. Yes, I think there's a lack of understanding of human nature in a lot of the critical social justice stuff. We are tribal and territorial animals. We have done best under liberal humanist situations where we push the limits of who we regard as our tribe to its furthest points. This is when we have then been able to care about people who aren't related to us, don't live in the same town as us, don't have the same religion or the same skin colour. If this kind of identity politics approach, where we understand everything in terms of knowledge attached to the lived experiences of people with certain identities and their relation to power, it's going to set off tribalistic tendencies that exist in all humans. And we see it in the social justice activists. And yes, we see it in the alt-right figures who are, traditionally racist. So I think we certainly do need to be aware that increasing tribalism by dividing people into groups is unlikely to result in more equality.
Yeah. No, I mean, it sounds fairly obvious on the face of it, doesn't it? I mean, the best distillation of all these ideas for people, if they want to get a deep dive and a sort of semi-academic perspective as well is your collaboration with James Lindsay, Cynical Theories. And you spend a great amount of time detailing the background of some of these ideas, because it may come as a surprise to many that they're not necessarily new ideas. A lot of them are sort of born out of established postmodernist thinking. So, I mean, maybe that's a good place to sort of start on that book, if you could explain to us exactly what postmodernism is for people who might not have a clue. If you could just summarise postmodernism for me, Helen, in 2 minutes or so, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So generally, I get a lot of very annoyed postmodernists who say that I am reductionist, but really what we need to look at from postmodernism, or post-structuralism more accurately, is the idea of knowledge, power and language and how they work together. So this arose in the late 60s, and it's the belief that knowledge is always produced by those who have the power to legitimize it. All that knowledge is a reflection of what the powerful want society to accept as true. Because it gets legitimated as knowledge, then everybody on every level of society speaks into that discourse, and oppressive systems are perpetuated this way. So we can see that there is truth in this. For example, when the church was an authority on sexuality, homosexuality was seen as a heinous sin. Then there were medical discourses at the end of the 19th century which held that homosexuality was a shameful disorder. Then there was the liberal discourse, which essentially says some people are gay, get over it. And then we've got the queer theory approach, which wants to just dismantle all concepts of gender, sex and sexuality altogether. So there are these different discourses. These ideas do change. A culture does exist. We do assume knowledge on a cultural level, but liberals have never denied this. This is why they have argued for the marketplace of ideas. This is why they have said we need to get all of these ideas into the same sphere. We need to be able to get at them all. We need to be able to argue with them all, test them out, see which are best. That's because liberals understand the power of culture and language and assumed knowledge. So the postmodernists find this too optimistic. And as their ideas developed into intersectional feminism and critical race theory and queer theory, it got more extreme in its sort of dismissal of the liberal approach and the idea that we are all just wandering around essentially in a dream, accepting as knowledge that which is fed to us. So this is where the idea of woke comes from, and it's sort of in the literature, it's often referred to as critical consciousness. It's when people learn to be able to see these systems of power and privilege that are theorized to exist, and then they can raise their own consciousness about them, and they can raise other people's consciousness about them. So that started off in the Marxist tradition, but it's taken on in the postmodern one as well. And now we have these critical theorists who believe that they can see white supremacy in every interaction, that they can see patriarchy, cisnormativity, and they need to point it all out to us and get us to learn to see it and get us to speak in the right way. Because if we speak in the right discourses, then that is the way to address oppression and these systems of power.
Right, that's very succinct. And I mean, just harking back to that idea of speaking in the right discourses, this is something you point out in Cynical Theories, and it's something that is evidently true, and that's a lot of the proponents of sort of critical race theory or intersectionality or wokeness, however you want to term it, will often write in a way that can only best be described as word salad. It seems meaningless on the face of it, but there's a lot of buzzwords thrown in, hegemony, things like that, privilege, systemic, and they connect them all together, and that tends to be their argument. Why is that? Why are the proponents of this ideology, the people who author the best-selling books on the issue or lecture on it, why are they such terrible communicators in print?
Well, I think that this was a significant problem, particularly within queer theory and post-colonial theory. So, this is when if you try to read something by Homi Bhabha or Judith Butler, you're likely to fail to understand a single word from it. Critical race theory has always been clearer in its language, probably because it develops from legal theory. And if you were to read Bill Gay and DiAngelo's Is Everybody Really Equal, which I would say is the go-to book to understand the critical social justice thinking, you could understand that as a 10-year-old. It will use those words of discourse, privilege, hegemony, etc., but they will explain them all and they will talk to you as though you are a child. It's become very, very clear, and this is because there's a greater confidence in these ideas. There's been a good 30 years of scholarship of it now, so people feel able to speak in terms of absolute certainty. You'll see people like Robin DiAngelo saying it is absolutely impossible for a white person not to be socialized into white supremacy. This is this is objective truth claims. So it's really diverged from the radical skepticism and uncertainty of the early postmodernists.
Yeah, I was so disappointed with white fragility. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I suspected I'd go in disagreeing with almost all of it, but I assumed the arguments would be harder to, get stuck into. I've often found books on people trying to argue for the existence of God more compelling and a little bit more difficult to grapple with and try to debunk. But it just felt to me, and this is a really cynical way of looking at it, but it just kind of felt like somebody working out their own prejudice and sense of white guilt to make them feel better to an audience who feels similarly. And I don't think it's representative of the average person, on the street or existing in 2021.
No, projection is definitely a thing that's happening. Someone made us this wonderful meme, and it has Freud at the top saying, it's not just that I want to sleep with my mother, it's that everyone wants to sleep with their mother. And then it has DiAngelo underneath saying, it's not just that I'm racist, it's that all white people are racist.
Right.
So, yeah, if you read Fragility and you read the account of DiAngelo going to a party and originally mistaking the one that she was meant to go to as the one that contained more black people and feeling afraid, then, you really do have to think, this could be your personal issue. This really could be something that you should work out with your psychologist. I don't, maybe certain subsections of society would actually be afraid of the idea of being among a group of black people and having a chat, but I don't think most of us would.
Well, something that comes through all the time with your work and a lot of your Twitter interactions is this idea of constantly having to reiterate your liberal credentials. I think erroneously a lot of people assume that anyone that's critical in this sphere must be a right-leaning conservative or worse. I think right-leaning conservative is probably the politest term they'll often throw your way. And you have to keep constantly reaffirming your liberal credentials. So it might just be a good point here to ask, how exactly do you identify as a liberal? What does being a liberal mean to you? What sort of school of thought could you point people towards to get a better grip on what liberalism is?
Okay, so really good books for what liberalism is are Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch, and also A Thousand Small Sanities by Adam Gopnik. And Edmund Fawcett, I can't remember the name of the book. I think there's something to do with the explanation of liberalism. But essentially with liberalism, what we're looking at is a confidence in the individual as the element, the unit of society, and the individual who must be allowed to have access to all that society has to offer. So it's individualism and universalism, humanism. There's freedom of belief and freedom of speech and plurality, the idea that we can live together and believe different things and have different religions and have different cultures. And we don't actually have to legislate one of them and control and make everyone else conform to it. It's essentially an aim for freedom and removing barriers in the way of any individual's success. So liberals are often conflated with leftists because leftists are more progressive, but classical liberals who tend to have more of a focus on the freedom of markets can also be conservatives. So the idea of a liberal conservative is perfectly coherent. However, I am a left liberal, and this is because I lean left on economic policies. I want to tax rich people a lot more to fund public services. I want more affordable housing. I want the NHS to do better, and generally left-leaning policies combined with a concern for the rights of women and racial and sexual minorities. I get myself in trouble with the gender critical feminists because I think it's quite clear that trans people are actually a marginalized minority group who face a lot of abuse. I also think that it is true that trans women cannot be accepted straightforwardly as women in every situation, or we're going to lose women's sports, and there's going to be safety issues in places like prisons and shelters. So I think there's a liberal sort of approach that we can take to things where we're using reason, we're using evidence, and we're getting a lot of diverse viewpoints together and having rational conversations. Yeah.
Well, you're someone who's always generated a fair amount of attention for your work over the years, whether it be editing a magazine, writing yourself, things like that. But these last 2 years or so, it's really blown up in terms of some of the things you've worked on in terms of generating headlines, attention on social media, things like that. And I can imagine it can be very difficult to operate in that sphere or keep a sense of balance or keep grounded when you've got that much coming towards you. And I think it's generally true, but not always, that when it's focused on social media, the bad stuff sort of sticks out like a sore thumb, and the attacks on you as a person. I'm just wondering how you're dealing with this new form of fame, in a way, this extra attention that you didn't really ask for, but nonetheless has become a byproduct of the work you do. How are you handling that?
Well, until recently, I wasn't handling it at all well. I actually became quite unwell mentally with the amount of abuse that I was getting. I was not able to use Twitter in a healthy way at all. I kept scrolling through my notifications and taking a lot of the misunderstandings to heart and feeling like I must clarify everything. I've got a lot better since I have it's got so bad now that I annoy huge numbers of people on the right as much as I annoy huge numbers of people on the left. There's so much of it. I can't even keep up with it, and I no longer try. So I use Twitter now mostly to broadcast, tweet threads of things that I'm thinking, share news of things that's happening. I'll check in and see, have a chat with a few of my regulars who have been there for years. But I can't deal with Twitter, and I think Twitter is a bad place to get sucked into if you are at all a mentally vulnerable person who is sort of psychologically inclined towards taking things to heart. Now, I personally would prefer to reduce my public profile a bit whilst increasing the effect that we're having. And this is largely what Counterweight is going to do. It's going to enable me to actually do things behind the scenes much more. An area, getting information out there. It doesn't always have to be focused on me as a person, but I can be doing practical things and not constantly be in the spotlight and be accused of being an SJW 1 minute and then a Nazi the next.
I can't, there's not a single opinion you can put out on Twitter without fostering in some sort of disagreement. It is rather insane. And speaking of social media in general, do you think as sort of evolved apes that we are, we're just not cut out to have this many voices and opinions coming in and out all at once at our every utterance? I don't think we're equipped for it mentally in general.
I have bought 3 books to read to try to understand this, and I haven't yet read any of them. So my opinion at the moment is not worth a great deal. But I was one of the people who used to argue that Twitter and other forms of social media are valuable tools if you just use them sensibly. So my essay on that was called "Hate Twitter, You Might Just Be Doing It Wrong." I totally recant everything I said in that essay now. It is a sewer, and it sucks you in. It brings out the worst in people. And, you have to have a really, really strong personality in order to be able to use that, use Twitter or other kinds of social media in a way where you can have productive conversations with other people and not sort of shrug off the unjust abuse and misinterpretations. You might need the zen of somebody like Sam Harris to be able to do this. And I don't have that. I don't think many people do.
It's interesting you mentioned Sam Harris, actually, because he does have that demeanour, but he has in fact purposely scaled back his social media activities in response to this sort of thing. I think he spoke very candidly about him torpedoing a family holiday because something was shared about him on the internet, and he had to deal with it there and then. And I think it has had an effect on even someone like Sam Harris. So it's difficult to navigate. I think my general rule is if I'm not having fun, it's time to log off, and I generally succeed in sticking by that. But obviously it's not a science, and we are irrational primates. And I suppose it leads me in a little bit to your collaborator James Lindsay on the book Cynical Theories that we referenced earlier. I've met Jim, I've interviewed him on a few episodes, and there's been some, I'd say, social media knives out in general in terms of your relationship and collaboration with him, because you've got a sort of political disagreement. And I'm not sure how that's affected your friendship. I'm not sure how much you're willing to state publicly. You kind of made a very dignified post on it about how you'll work through it with Jim personally. But as you are both, in a sense, public figures, people are naturally curious about it. And I just wonder if there's anything you'd like to clear up about that maybe you haven't discussed, or maybe you just want to reiterate your original point.
Probably just reiterate my original point. So Jim obviously has advised people to vote for Trump, while I urged Americans to vote for Biden. We're taking quite a different approach to things at the moment. We both still agree with the contents of Cynical Theories, but where we go from there on that, we have some differences now. Having differences is normal. And if it comes to any problems I actually have with Jim or him with me, we will discuss them in private, because that is what you do when you're friends. And I'm not remotely inclined to indulge anybody's, not you, but anybody's desire for gossip.
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the things that does tend to ruin ruin Twitter rather, is the drama. And there is this strange inclination to instantly go to war with people you otherwise had perfectly good and healthy relationships when you throw social media into the mix. And I see this time and time again, and I've probably been a part of it in ways myself. And is there something to be said for getting back? And I mean, I appreciate we're in the midst of a lockdown and a pandemic, but is there something to be said about getting back to proper face-to-face, or even just vocal discussions with each other rather than digital screen discussions where you're playing to an audience as well?
I think certainly yes. Talking to somebody by Skype, or even using a platform like Letter, where you're just speaking to one person and you have time to think about and put down your ideas in a thoughtful way. I think that's better than Twitter, where there is the temptation to snipe and score points, and it doesn't really allow for thoughtful conversation. So I would like to get back to to more productive conversations. However, I always said I'm not really a speaker. I consider myself to be a writer. I'm a very introverted person, and I much prefer to write than to speak. So if it came to all conversations being face to face, I'd probably only have 2 a month. So but writing at more length would be better than writing a snarky comment on Twitter, particularly if your intention is just to translate somebody else into meaning something they don't mean. So
I think that's more frustrating. I'd rather somebody call me a fucking idiot and tell me I'm wrong than represent me in a way I just don't recognise at all. I think there's something deeply more frustrating about that than being told you're wrong.
Yeah, I mean, so many people, when we announced the launch of Counterweight, and there's plenty of information there saying how we're a liberal humanist organisation for liberal understandings of social justice and opposition to racism. People just translated it as we exist to help racist people be racist without any consequences. So that is quite annoying, but I can ignore this now because it's so blatantly a misrepresentation. Where I'm liable to get sucked in is if someone seems to be being kind and generous and meeting half of my point, but then missing a vital part of it.
Right.
I cannot leave that alone. I have to tidy that up. It almost feels like, because I have suffered from OCD, although I've largely overcome it now. It does feel like I've set my shelf out neatly with my point. Someone has come along and moved something, and I can't bear it. I have to move it back. And I have to do that over and over again until they stop doing it. And I have people in my DMs saying, "You have clarified yourself enough. Get off Twitter for the love of God."
I can relate to this one because there's a part of you that thinks if I just phrase this in just the right way in my 25th tweet on the matter, the penny will drop and the problem will go away. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned there. I mean, you said you're not a public speaker, but I think you're perfectly competent. I've seen you speak a few times. We've even shared a panel together, and I thought you was great. And obviously, you're incredibly knowledgeable about the situation, so it's very valuable to have someone like you who says, I'm going to go out there and do events and speak on panels and things like that. What is it about the public speaking aspect that gets to you? Is it the nerves? I mean, what's the worst case scenario? What's the biggest fear you have about getting up to that podium?
I think I prefer to be a writer because I can qualify, double check and edit myself. You know, so there's always the fear that I'm going to get something slightly wrong if I'm speaking spontaneously. For example, on one podcast, I said that Foucault had said liberal secular democracy was the most oppressive and awful thing, when in fact he said the Enlightenment led to capitalism, which was the most awful. But you know, it was a slight misquote.
Yeah,
I was speaking spontaneously.
It wasn't an attempt to deceive. It was basically you misspoke.
Yeah. So if I'd been writing, I would have gone through that editing, thinking I need to clarify that a bit more, put a bit more in there, and I tend to overqualify, apparently, as all my editors tell me that I don't need to qualify and disclaim absolutely everything, but I have a tendency to do that. So I think sometimes that's why I feel less confident with speaking. I think I can put things in a way which don't really convey what I'm trying to convey. But as you have so kindly said, having done this a few times now, I do seem to mostly get my point across as I intend to. It's rare that I say something and then think that's not what I meant.
Yeah, experience really does help, doesn't it? I suppose the spotlight syndrome has a lot to answer for, doesn't it? I think you tend to think things that you do or say are more noticeable to other people than they actually are. I when I've spoke a few times, I've assumed that I was just awful and sounded really nervous, and I've listened back and it's half as bad as I imagined it would be. So I suppose, yeah. So tell me a little bit more about Counterweight. I think when I first saw you launch, I thought you was opening a gym for a moment? You have been sharing some, personal fitness and, exercise success stories on your Twitter as well, but it's obviously you really straying into direct activism now, because obviously I imagine you would have thought your writing played a huge part of that, as it obviously does. People read things, form opinions, change behaviours, etc. And that's certainly part of the pushback. But this is a direct action in this area. It's direct support now. So what made you do, apart from wanting to get out the public eye, in a sense, what made you start to want to get into it in a hands-on sense?
Well, I started getting, after the death of George Floyd and the BLM protests, and then a lot of companies started instituting new policies and training programs. So we were all getting hundreds of emails from people. Jim was getting thousands a day at one point, saying, I am in trouble. Can you help me? What do I do? So I made a Discord server in order to triage the people in immediate danger. And provide assistance to them, while sort of offering a community and resources for people with less urgent problems. Then along came this woman named Carrie Clark, who said, hello, I've volunteered for the Citizens Advice Bureau before, and I can see some ways to make this more effective. Would you like some help? And I said, yes, please. And then she just transformed everything into a caseworker system and tidied everything up around me. And then suddenly everything was just working really, really well. So Counterweight belongs to both me and Carrie. We are partners in it. I am the one who deals with the academic stuff and the activist stuff. She is the project coordinator. And it works because of that combination of those two things, her very practical, systemizing, organized mind, and my kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the problem.
That's excellent. Giving people some recourse and the confidence to maybe put their hand up in a group meeting or some mandated training and provide a bit of pushback is exactly the way to go about it. I mean, I can speak from experience. I mean, you mentioned George Floyd there, and obviously that's a very tragic injustice that I don't know a single person who wouldn't agree with that, but it is a very American-centric issue. And of late, my employer, in fact, put on, it was a voluntary workshop titled Everyday Racism. So naturally I volunteered because I wanted to see what was being fed to the staff, and hundreds of people turned up for this sort of virtual group meeting, and it was hosted by some sort of social media stars, and they basically spent the first 10 minutes or so of this talk speaking up the injustices of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and police shootings in America and police brutality, which is all, there's something to that. There's something to be discussed. But at the end of the discussion, when it came time for Q&A, I raised the suggestion that maybe we're viewing this through a very, American-centric lens, and we're importing a lot of the issues they have with race relations that we just don't have in terms of police shooting. And when I raised the issue of BLM being political in nature and not necessarily just an anti-racist group, but they essentially told me that I'm just not in a position to have an opinion on how somebody responds to George Floyd's death because of my skin colour. I was literally told that on work time that my opinion was worth less because of my skin colour, and that didn't raise an eyebrow with anyone. That's almost a progressive view now, that you're white, you don't have any right to talk about these things. Now, how do we provide better tools, better rhetoric, and more confidence for people to speak up in them situations? Because it's fine for me. I'm happy to speak up. I'm gobby as it is, argumentative. I've read a lot on it. I know where the buzzwords are and the flags are. But to the average person, just going to a workshop on these issues might not feel as confident. So what kind of resources can they get to from your new endeavour?
So we have got a number of, under links, there's a number of resources there, how to speak to your employer about anti-racism, which I wrote with Jim, and template letters people can use, and how to be not racist, so that people can feel confident in articulating their colourblindness in a positive way. You know, we're not going to put social significance into skin colour, and we're going to oppose anybody who does. So we've got those resources up there. It's still going to be more difficult for white people to speak about racism and men to speak about sexism if we're going in with this whole standpoint epistemology. But a lot of our members are not white, and a number of them have managed to get themselves onto equity, diversity and inclusion boards, where they are doing really good work at keeping their organisations open to a sort of a greater diversity of viewpoints. So that's something we are particularly proud of. Is that I sometimes feel a bit like a spy master, because I have people, some of our members in all sorts of influential organisations throughout the country, who are getting involved in the policy making in their institution, and they are getting it to draw back from this narrowly critical social justice approach. One woman made my day, just made me, when I was exhausted and I was thinking, are we actually achieving anything? She wrote to me a major humanitarian cause, saying that she'd got 6 of the branches not to spend ridiculous amounts of money on unconscious bias training, and instead spend it on medical services for people in desperate need. And I just, yes, this is, you know, it's working. People are pushing back, and it isn't only employees. We can do a lot with one employee who sees a problem and comes to us. They can sound out other people. They'll quite often find there's more people who agree with them than they realize. They can address things diplomatically. There's a lot they can do, but there's also a lot of employers who contact us, so many that we're actually setting up a consultancy service where we can help employers to develop their policies in ways that aren't critical social justice based, which oppose racism, sexism, etc., but in more ethical, liberal ways. So that is very encouraging, and this is why I'm saying to people sometimes, if they write in and they say, my employer wants to start this anti-racist workshop, I think, well, slow down and wait to find out what it is they're planning to do. We know a lot of employers are planning to do very inclusive versions of this, because they're coming to us to ask us how to do that.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and that's obviously, it ties back to the point you made at the beginning about people confusing anti-racism, conflating anti-racism with there being no racism or responding to it in that way. But there are obviously valuable ways you can do anti-racism, and it is vital, it is important. I've seen many initiatives going up from my short 36 years on the planet that have been really valuable and have championed a very positive message. I think it's just kind of trying to recognise when we're seeing a very destructive, ultra far left CRT basic version of it. That's the issue. I suppose my final question before I let you get back to your evening is, how confident are you, or rather hopeful are you, that we can dial some of this back before it inevitably blows up in our faces? This big march to the woke utopia that seems to be at full charge. Is this something that we can rein in before it gets a grip of all our institutions and places of employment, do you think?
I think we can, yes. And by we, I mean the UK. Yeah. I am very much afraid of what is happening in the US. I understand why people are less confident of being able to establish a more liberal sort of approach to things with conversation with the volatile state of politics in the US right now. I'm not given to overstatement, but I think the danger of a civil war actually happening isn't at zero. There's a risk there, but I think the UK and Australia we have the chance to pull back from it. And I think that we are already starting to do that. And unfortunately, America is a warning sign for a lot of other countries who have seeing the problem and are not recognizing it. Oh, it's just a few mad students and a few silly papers. Well, no, it isn't. It's an ideology, and it grips people like a religious ideology can, and it makes good people do bad things. So yes, let's turn back from it. I think we can.
Agreed. Okay. Well, Helen, I've really enjoyed catching up with you. It's been lovely to see you as well. It's been a while. Where can everyone find Counterweight as well? Where can you point them to?
Counterweightsupport.com is our website, and on YouTube we are Counterweight Media. So we've got a lot of short educational videos there which are getting a lot of attention, and people are finding them particularly useful.
Wonderful. Is there anything else you'd like to say or point people to before I let you get back to what I've stole from your evening?
Yeah, no, well, definitely read Cynical Theories, and we're hoping to have a young adult version coming out soon so that younger people can have a look at the ideas and evaluate them as well. I think Generation Z are going to be the ones to win this.
We're putting all our hope on them. All right, Helen. Thank you very much. This has been a pleasure. It's flown by.
Yeah, lovely to see you again, Stephen.
Wonderful.